Chapter 31. By the time Pei Chi went out, the sky was getting dark. It would take about 10 minutes to walk from there to the bus stop. She dragged her suitcase forward slowly, aimlessly. Blisters had already formed on her feet and they hurt, but she didn't care, because her heart hurt even more. It was a long road with kapok growing on both sides. It was especially quiet in the summer night, and only her footsteps could be heard. Very quickly, this silence was broken. A sports car drove over slowly and finally stopped in front of Pei Chi, blocking the road. Pei Chi stopped in her tracks. The car window wound down. It was Lin Jinrong. He looked at her quietly, his handsome face extremely conflicted. "Get in." Pei Chi took a step back and shook her head. "No need." In that instant, she didn't feel fake. But she knew that from the moment she stepped into Tang Yu's bedroom, it was already impossible for them to be together. Liking him might be her last dream. Once she woke up from it, there would be nothing left. Luckily, neither of them said it out loud. Lin Jinrong opened the car door and got out, walking to her. Pei Chi wanted to pull her suitcase and leave, but he tightened his grip on it. Following that, he said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Chi, I'm sorry." If Pei Chi was said to be strong, and she was already immune to all kinds of poisons when she faced Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan at the Pei residence, then at this moment, Lin Jinrong's apology still shattered the last trace of softness in her. She moved her hand away and broke free from his grip. She tilted her head slightly, trying to stop herself from crying. She had liked Lin Jinrong before, and perhaps she still liked him now, like was a more subtle word than love. Love is a kind of emotion that has been thoroughly released, but liking, there is no. That was why it was more beautiful, but also more painful. When her gaze landed on his young and handsome face again, she had already regained her composure. She even had a nonchalant smile on her face. "Lin Jinrong, what's there to be sorry about? From now on, you will be my brother-in-law. Also, I am very good now." She looked at him with a smile on her face, but there was no trace of a smile in her eyes. "Look at this dress of mine. I didn't even know what brand it was before. It's very expensive." Lin Jinrong, Pei Huan didn't lie. "I've already moved out to live with another man. He treats me very well and can give me everything." Pei Chi looked straight at him without dodging his gaze. Lin Jinrong's eyes narrowed. He grabbed her shoulder and said, "Pei Chi, don't talk about this anymore." Did she think that he would believe her? Even if it was true, he could still give it to her. Lin Jinrong felt a little sad in his heart. Pei Chi gently broke free from him. "Lin Jinrong, don't do this again." She walked forward while he stood behind her. He suddenly shouted at her, "Pei Chi, I like you." Pei Chi's body froze. She didn't respond, nor did she stop walking. She could no longer bear his liking. The current Pei Chi was no longer the Pei Chi of the past. If she could do it all over again, even if Lin Jinrong wasn't with Pei Huan, she thought that she would still walk into Tang Yu's room. Her birth had left her with no other choice. Chapter 32. Lin Jinrong kept looking at her. He knew that it was useless to say all this because he was going to marry Pei Huan. Pei Chi was crying. She stood in the wind gap. Cars came and went on the road. Finally, she stopped a taxi. The driver helped her carry her luggage into the car and subconsciously glanced at her. It was rare to see such a beautiful young lady. Pei Chi sat in the back seat and kept looking out of the window. The driver observed her for a long time and sighed softly. "Young lady, are you out of love?" "No." Pei Chi felt a little uncomfortable and wiped her face with a tissue. The driver smiled. "Then what's so sad about it?" "No." Pei Chi's voice was a little stiff. The driver smiled even more happily. "Then if you're not sad, can you tell me where to go?" Pei Chi came back to her senses. It seemed that she hadn't told him the address. She quickly said, "Xia City." Xia City is a high-end residential area. Ordinary people can't buy it even if they have money. The driver cheered. Pei Chi didn't say anything else. The car stopped. The fare was more than 70 yuan. Pei Chi gave a 100 yuan bill and the driver got back 50 yuan. Just treat it as a chat discount. Alas, such a beautiful young lady. It was worth it even if she didn't pay. Pei Chi thanked the driver in a low voice and got out of the car. The driver helped her carry her luggage and shook his head as he watched her walk to the elevator. Sometimes, it wasn't a good thing to look like this. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were still red. When she walked back, she rubbed her eyes. When she opened the door, she was stunned because Tang Yu was there too. Today was Tuesday, and he came yesterday. Was he going to be here from Monday to Sunday? She slowly closed the door. The sound made Tang Yu, who was handling work, look up. He looked at her and the luggage in her hands and asked calmly, "Are you going to get your things?" Pei Chi-Chi grunted and dragged the luggage in. Then she asked him hesitantly, "Can I put my things here?" Tang Yu's fingers left the keyboard and he looked at her seriously, watching the redness in her eyes. After a long time, he said indifferently, "Of course." He paused. "You can change this place however you want." Pei Chi-Chi nodded in acknowledgement. She dragged her luggage to the changing room and hung up her clothes. She could not help but see the clothes he had prepared for her today. All of them were dressed like ladies, and he seemed to have a preference for white and pink. But underwear was different. It was very mature and sexy. She looked at it for a while and then packed up her things. Finally, she took out a small crystal music box. It was a gift from Pei Mingyi on her 10th birthday. She still remembered the day when her father held her and sang a birthday song. She had received the most expensive gift in her life. There was only one day when Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan weren't there. That day, she felt like a little princess. She didn't have to look at other people's faces, and she could laugh whenever she wanted. All her happiness was given to her by Pei Mingyi. Tang Yu stood at the door of the changing room and looked at Pei Chi-Chi, who was squatting there and looking at the thing in her hands. He recognized it. It was a crystal product from a certain brand. There was a lot of it in Tang Xian's room, but the silly girl in front of him treated it like a treasure. "Who gave it to you?" He asked a question that even he did not expect. Chapter 33. Tang Yu's expression softened a little. "Then you must have a good relationship with him." Pei Chi-Chi didn't say anything. She didn't want to talk about this with him. How could Tang Yu not see it? He smiled faintly. "Have you eaten?" She wouldn't have felt hungry if he didn't mention it. Now that he mentioned it, she was really hungry. She nodded. Actually, she was afraid that he would suggest doing something else. Tang Yu walked out and said, "The helper didn't come today. Do you know how to cook?" Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. "Yes." Tang Yu thought for a while and turned to look at her. "Do you know how to make chicken noodles?" Pei Chi-Chi nodded. "Chicken shredded noodles it is then." He made the decision on his own. Pei Chi-Chi totally thought that he came here because he was tired of eating out. She started immediately, even though she was already very tired. She thought that it would be easier to serve his stomach than his body. When she was stewing the chicken soup in the pressure cooker, she even thought that maybe her cooking skills were more attractive to him than her body. She could cook for him every day in the future. However, reality was cruel. While she was concentrating on making the soup, a pair of big hands wrapped around her waist, and his warm breath blew on the back of her soft neck. He said in a low and husky voice, "How much longer do you need? I'm a little hungry." He raised his hand to show her the time. It was 8 o'clock. Then, he bit her little neck as a punishment. "Don't come back so late in the future." Pei Chi-Chi was a little absent-minded after being bitten by him. She wondered if she should talk to him about Monday to Sunday. However, this was obviously not a good time. Fortunately, he only grumbled for a while and left, and she was relieved. Tang Yu walked back to the living room. He wasn't in the mood to deal with work anymore. He tidied up and picked up a magazine to read. From Pei Chi-Chi's direction, she could see him sitting there lazily with his legs crossed, leisurely and elegant. She looked at his profile and felt that he looked familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The chicken soup was ready. She tasted it and filled 2 bowls with it. She scooped the whole chicken out and cooled it down with cold water. Then, she shredded the chicken and put it aside. She washed the vegetables and a few mushrooms. 10 minutes later, 2 bowls of fragrant noodles were served on the dining table. Her excellent cooking skills were all thanks to Zhou Meilin's harsh treatment of her. Smelling the fragrance, Tang Yu put down the magazine in his hand and walked over to sit down. "Have a taste." Pei Chi-Chi sat beside him and murmured. Her expression was a little nervous. Tang Yu tilted his head and smiled. "It smells good." As for its appearance, it was also quite good. He took a bite and found that the taste was very pure and surprisingly good. Tang Yu quickly finished his bowl, put down his chopsticks, and looked at her. Pei Chi ate very slowly, and there was still more than half of the food in her bowl. Feeling his gaze, Pei Chi looked up and asked hesitantly, "Do you want to eat more?" Tang Yu didn't say anything, but usually, if a proud man didn't say anything, it meant that he agreed. "I'll go get another bowl then." Pei Chi had already stood up as she said that. A slender and good-looking hand covered the back of her hand, and an elegant male voice said, "No need." Tang Yu paused, and his gaze fell on her bowl. "Can you eat it?" Pei Chi was petrified. She shook her head extremely slowly. Was he going to eat the leftovers? Chapter 34. It was as if he was saying, "This project is worth 500 million yuan. Pei Chi had to admit that she was a little dazed. She was stunned for a while, and then she carefully and hesitantly gave him all the essence in her bowl. On one hand, Tang Yu was pleased by her expression. In her heart, he should be the good-looking type. On the other hand, looking at her actions, he frowned and still sat there. "Another bowl?" Pei Chi let out an ah. He had already taken the bowl she was eating and pushed his bowl in front of her. Looking at the way he ate, Pei Chi was a little dazed. Didn't he find it dirty? But when she thought about how he wanted to kiss her there that night, she felt that it wasn't a problem at all. Tang Yu ate a few mouthfuls. Seeing that Pei Chi wasn't eating, he raised his eyebrows slightly. "Don't you want more nutrition at this time?" Pei Chi was a little petrified. Looking at the bowl full of chicken shreds and shiitake mushrooms, the image in her mind was a little white rabbit being fed by a big bad wolf, and in the end, it was eaten in one bite. "Hurry up and eat." His voice was a little deeper, as if he wasn't happy that she was distracted. Pei Chi didn't dare to think about it anymore. She took small bites of the noodles. Tang Yu looked at her for a while and didn't say anything else. He finished the noodles. Of course, she was the one who washed the dishes. After washing them, she saw him sitting on the sofa dealing with work. Pei Chi was a little embarrassed. He seemed to be very busy. Luckily, he was busy, she thought secretly. But no matter how busy he was, Mr. Tang still had time to play with his new pet. He was an introverted man. If he didn't restrain himself, she would know how happy he was to have such a little pet, and how he couldn't wait to play with her. He could do this, that, and that again, over and over again. But now she could only think about it. She had her period, so it was better not to scare her. Tang Yu could feel her walking around. Sometimes she took her pajamas to take a shower, and sometimes she went in with a hairdryer. Slowly, he became distracted, and the work in his hands no longer interested him. At last he got up and went to the bedroom. Pei Chi was sitting on the bed, holding her long black hair with one hand. There was still some moisture on it, and it was hanging on her shoulder. Holding the hairdryer in one hand, he concentrated on drying his hair. When he opened the door, she stared at him in surprise. Her legs moved restlessly. Tang Yu's gaze landed on her fair legs. Because her pajamas were rolled up, it was very alluring. Sensing his gaze, Pei Chi hurriedly pulled up her pajamas and lowered her gaze. She wanted to get off the bed, but when her feet touched the ground, she frowned. Her feet hurt. Tang Yu walked over and stood in front of her. Pei Chi was very uneasy, afraid that he would do something. "Sit on it." His voice was a little hoarse, but it also contained a hidden heat. If Pei Chi knew more about the love between a man and a woman, she would understand that it was a sign that a man was aroused. She was a little scared, but she didn't dare to disobey him, so she sat down obediently. Tang Yu sat beside her, reached out to hold one of her little feet, and placed it on his knee. "There are blisters," he said calmly as he looked at the white, transparent thing that was the size of a soybean. "Oh," Pei Chi replied. Feeling that he wanted to touch it, she couldn't help but scream, "No." Chapter 35. She was afraid of pain, and he didn't look like he was going to get angry. Hence, she mustered her courage and said, "Adults are afraid of pain too." He looked at her for a long time before saying slowly, "Why weren't you afraid that time?" Huh. It took Pei Chi 5 seconds to realize what he had said. Her face immediately turned red. From her cheeks to her ears, and down to her neck. Her entire body was pink. She was cute and sexy at the same time. Tang Yu's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that he hadn't seen beauties before, but for such a young little thing to sit by his bed and tell him that it hurt, his heart couldn't help but soften a little. He suddenly carried her. Pei Chi was shocked and immediately hugged his neck, afraid that she would fall off. However, he only carried her onto his lap and said in a deep voice, "Sit properly." Pei Chi didn't dare to move and just sat there quietly. Actually, she didn't think that he would be willing to do such a thing for her. No matter how clean her feet were, they were still feet. She stole a glance at him. His face was filled with a sense of intimacy. If she hadn't leaned in close, she wouldn't have known that he had turned into a wolf. However, she didn't know that all men were so perverted. Tang Yu bent down slightly and held her little feet again. They were fair, tender, and especially soft. Pei Chi felt that the blister was a little painful. She knew that he was going to help her squeeze it. She was afraid. Her little hands hugged him tighter and her little face was buried in his neck. His masculine scent calmed her down a lot, but there was a tinge of panic in her heart. She wanted to move away, but the pain in her feet made her hug him even tighter. To Tang Yu, this was a rather big test. She was hugging him so tightly that their bodies were almost sticking to each other. He was a little annoyed, so he used more strength. Pei Chi howled in pain and then she bit his shoulder in a very offensive manner. Tang Yu's body froze, but his hands didn't stop moving and continued to pop her blister. Pei Chi didn't let him go either. He retracted his hand and cupped her little face along her curves. Pei Chi panted and lowered her eyes, not daring to look at him. She could feel how hot his eyes were looking at her. Her body, slightly trembling, unspeakably fragile. After a long time, she looked up, and before she could react, her lips were kissed by him. Her hair was scattered messily over her shoulders, and her little hands were still wrapped around his neck. Tang Yu kissed her passionately, holding her little head with one hand. Her body trembled, and she was at a complete loss. Her small body was warm, with a hint of fragrance after bathing. Tang Yu finally let go of her little mouth. Pei Chi fell weakly on his shoulder, and the breath that came out from her little mouth was fragrant and sweet. His fingers moved her little face, and she looked away awkwardly. Her little mouth was as red as a rose. Tang Yu's fingers caressed it gently, and his gaze was a little deep. Pei Chi couldn't take it anymore. Her entire body was like a reed in the wind, breaking at any moment. Finally, as though he had had enough, he let go of her and chuckled. He put her aside and walked outside, returning with a first aid kit. Pei Chi cried out softly, "I'll do it myself." Chapter 36. Pei Chi found some gauze and carefully bandaged the small wound. If it had been in the past, she would not have treated such a small wound. But now that he was her sugar daddy, he had the right to ask her to maintain her perfect appearance. Tang Yu watched for a while before walking out again. When he came back, there was a faint smell of cigarettes on him. Pei Chi looked up at him. He went straight into the changing room, changed into a set of clothes, and went out. Pei Chi was a little surprised as she stared blankly at his back. When Tang Yu walked out of the bedroom, he turned back to look at her and her feet, which were wrapped like little dumplings. That little thing sat there, looking incomparably weak and obedient. "Sleep early." His voice was a little hoarse, and then he left without waiting for her to speak. Pei Chi sat there without moving. After a while, she heard the sound of the door closing. He had left. She looked at her feet again and thought of the kiss. At that time, he wanted it, right? Thinking of this, her face heated up. After a while, she could not stand it anymore, so she tiptoed to the bathroom to wash her face. But looking at the mirror, she almost did not recognize herself. The person in the mirror had a red face, and her eyes were almost dripping water. Her red lips looked like they had been bitten. They were slightly opened, and it was indescribably seductive. Pei Chi was flustered and did not dare to look anymore. She splashed cold water on her face and finally calmed down after a while. In her heart, there was a deep fear. She did not know what this fear was. Back in the bedroom, she could not fall asleep for a long time. She went to the changing room again and looked through her things one by one. Finally, she fell asleep hugging the crystal music box. Her heart slowly calmed down in the crisp sound of the music. Tang Yu came over early in the morning. Originally, he would not have come back here. However, when the car passed by, he unexpectedly got in. After taking a shower and changing into a set of clothes, it was already 6:30. Pei Chi still did not show any signs of waking up. He stood by the bed and watched. When the music box was opened, it made a crisp sound. He could tell that it was a song sung by a young girl. To Alice. As for his new pet, a small hand reached out of the blanket, revealing a tender part of its body. It was holding a small music box. So precious. Tang Yu smiled and frowned. He raised his hand and looked at his watch. He had a breakfast meeting with the CEO of Megao at 7, and now he was looking at his little pet sleeping soundly. He quickly walked out, his gaze somewhat cold. He must have gone mad. When Pei Chi woke up, it was already close to 8 o'clock. She immediately jumped up and quickly brushed her teeth and washed her face. When she went out with her bag, she saw breakfast on the dining table. It was Chinese. Her heart warmed. She took a bun and ate it as she walked. Fortunately, she was not late when she arrived at school. Because she had been really tired for the past few days, she had been dozing off in class. Chun Xinjia used a book to cover her and said softly, "Chi-Chi, if you really can't take it, let's quit. Look at how thin your face is after earning some money." Pei Chi touched her own face. Really? Chapter 37. Pei Chi shakes her head. She doesn't want to trouble Chun Xinjia all the time, and she can still bear it. Chun Xinjia sighs, "Chi-Chi, you really don't live up to your good looks." Pei Chi knows what she means, so she doesn't say anything. She just smiles and continues to listen to the class. The afternoon class ends at 2:30 p.m. She goes to the bathroom to change her clothes, and then takes a taxi to Shangyuan. After knowing that Tang Yu is the CEO of Shangyuan, she wears a set of clothes when she goes out in Xia City, and another set when she goes back to Shangyuan. In the taxi, she ties up her hair, puts on lipstick, and puts on her glasses. The driver looks at her and shakes his head. "Little girl, you are very good looking. Are you going to participate in a talent show?" "Yes." Pei Chi agrees with him, and then secretly looks at herself in the mirror. She looks quite devilish. It's 3 o'clock when she arrives at Shangyuan. She immediately changes into her uniform and reports to the personnel department. Sister One is not here today, and the deputy director, Guan Xiaoning, is in charge. Guan Xiaoning is in her early 30s, and she is not married yet. When Sister One is not here, she likes to be called Director Guan instead of Deputy Director Guan. Pei Chi stands in front of her. Guan Xiaoning looks at her lipstick, and so does Pei Chi. She only feels that Director Guan's lipstick is darker than hers. "Are you a new working student?" Guan Xiaoning looks at Pei Chi's uniform and feels that it is an eyesore. Is it necessary for a working student to wear a uniform? Moreover, she is dressed so seductively. However, dressing like this is what she wants. Otherwise, the entire personnel department of Shangyuan will break their heads. Guan Xiaoning has seen Pei Chi's original appearance. Pei Chi knows that she is not a good person at first glance. Her heart thumps, but she still smiles lightly. Yes. Guan Xiaoning walks out in high heels, twisting her waist. Xiaolu immediately slides her chair over and whispers, "This evildoer is going to make trouble again. Sister Wen's rest day is our day of suffering." At that moment, the sound of high heels rang out again. Xiaolu gave him a look and quickly returned to his seat. Guan Xiaoning brought in a slightly plump girl with a serious face. "She just arrived today. She's taking over from you to deliver the documents." Pei Chi waited quietly, while Xiaolu secretly glanced over. Sure enough, Guan Xiaoning continued, "Today, the cleaners are a little short on manpower. Pei Chi, you're in charge of cleaning the lobby on the first floor. You don't have to wear your uniform. I'll get someone to bring a set of work clothes over." He was obviously making things difficult for her. Pei Chi understood that, so she didn't say anything and just nodded. She moved the uniform to the chubby girl, but it took her about 10 minutes to squeeze all the fat into the uniform. Pei Chi and Xiaolu helped out and were sweating profusely from exhaustion. However, it did not grow for a long time. The clothes still tightened for a moment, and then the thread was stretched open, and the flesh was squeezed out inch by inch. At last, it swayed gently. That scene was too beautiful. Xiaolu rolled her eyes. Guan Xiaoning is deliberately tormenting people. When the tiger is not in the mountain, the monkey becomes the king. Pei Qiqi laughed. Xiaolu was worried for her. Look at you. You're still laughing. You've been sent to mop the floor. Anyway, it's just hard labor. It's not a big deal. Pei Qiqi was also open-minded. Chapter 38. Don't worry, I'll do it all the same. Pei Qiqi changed into the uniform of a cleaner. Her already dark lipstick looked even more conspicuous now. Xiaolu shook his head and walked out. Pei Qiqi, there's something wrong with your brain. Pei Qiqi did not have a problem. She just did not have a choice. She also hesitated whether to leave Shang Yuan. After all, there was the risk of being discovered by Tang Yu. But in the end, she decided to stay. The salary of 4,000 yuan was very high for a second-year student. After collecting the tools, she went to the first floor to do some work. When she went down, she found out that there was not only the lobby, but also the washroom. In the entire building, the washroom on the first floor was the most frequently used one. It was often dirty after only half an hour of cleaning. This work was not as easy as running errands. She almost had to bend over to do it. Tang Yu and Ming Qingqing walked into the lobby. When they were about to enter the elevator, they suddenly saw Pei Qiqi. He narrowed his eyes and stopped in his tracks. Ming Qingqing followed his gaze and gasped. Who asked Pei Qiqi to mop the floor? And what's more, she was dressed like this. He knew that cleaning the first floor was the most difficult work. At this moment, Pei Qiqi's body was covered in sweat. Her hair was also half wet. He glanced at Tang Yu and felt his anger. Sigh, someone was going to be unlucky. Tang Yu looked at Pei Qiqi. After a while, he said, transfer her to the CEO's office to clean. In addition, the person who arranged her work, he paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to Ming Qingqing's face. You know what to do. Ming Qingqing had been with him for a long time. How could he not know? Tang Yu entered the elevator first. When he turned around, he saw Pei Qiqi's face, which was covered in sweat. His heart skipped a beat for no reason. Ming Qingqing called the HR department and learned that Sister Wan was not here today. He then asked Guan Xiaoning. Guan Xiaoning had long admired Ming Qingqing. She said that she had sent the cleaning staff on the first floor. Now, I'm transferring her. Ming Qingqing said lightly and then added, as for you, from now on, you are no longer the deputy director of the HR department. He thought that if Tang Yu handled this matter personally, it would not be so easy to get rid of him. But Guan Xiaoning couldn't accept it and screamed, Special Assistant Ming. Ming Qingqing hung up the phone expressionlessly. He had never had any feelings towards this love-struck woman. 5 minutes later, an elite manager personally went down to invite the cleaner, Pei Qiqi. Miss Pei, the HR department has made some arrangements. The CEO's office needs to be cleaned today. Please prepare. Pei Qiqi was stunned. She instinctively wanted to reject him, but the manager smiled and said, It's easy. Besides, the CEO isn't here. Not here. Pei Qiqi believed him and went up with the manager. But when she opened the door, she was stunned. Who else could it be other than Tang Yu, who was sitting behind the wooden desk? It was midsummer, and the air conditioning in the office was on full blast. Pei Qiqi was sweating all over. She sneezed as soon as she went in. She was a little uncomfortable. The door behind her was closed. Her heart thumped, and then she was a little dazed. The whole office was covered with a pure white woolen carpet, and she was carrying a bucket in her hand. Stunned for a moment, he immediately carried the bucket out, leaving only a rag in his hand. Chapter 39. Pei Qiqi looked very disheveled. Her lipstick had fallen off a little, but she did not look as shocked as before. He only looked at her for a while before he lowered his head and said lightly, Clean up the bookshelves. Pei Qiqi looked around the room. The entire wall facing Tang Yu's desk was filled with bookshelves. It was very huge, but it was quite clean. Everything that Mr. Tang owns is very huge. She covered her face and laughed. Pei Qiqi hesitated for a moment. She looked at the pure white carpet and her dirty shoes. She could not step on it no matter how hard she tried. Tang Yu looked at her with a slight frown and said, Come in, Pei Chi said softly. The carpet is too white. Come in. His voice sounded a little impatient. Pei Chi immediately went in. She looked at the bookshelves. They were actually very clean, perhaps even cleaner than her cleaning cloth. However, she did not dare to disobey his orders. She carefully wiped them and took a peek. The books on the shelves were not only related to the company, but also a lot of original documents. Pei Chi did not dare to look too much. She only dared to work. It was very cold here, but she sweated more than she did on the first floor. She always felt that there was a pair of eyes watching her from behind. She was afraid that he would recognize her, so she kept her back facing Tang Yu. She did not know how sexy she looked with her sweaty clothes sticking to her waist. Through the translucent fabric, her thin shoulder bones could be vaguely seen. They slowly stretched as her body moved up and down. Sometimes, she tiptoed and raised her body to reach the top. This also caused her knee-length skirt to rise. It was just a cleaner skirt. At this moment, most of her legs were exposed, but it gave off a vivacious vibe, especially when her top was sticking to her body. He was not in the mood to work anymore. He was a little annoyed. He looked at her legs, which were white and swaying. Occasionally, she would squat down. Tang Yu reached out and tugged at his tie. He loosened it a little, but he still felt a little hot. He seemed to have made a wrong decision. Pei Chi didn't feel a certain someone's immoral gaze at all. She wiped the bookcase diligently and secretly peeked at the things displayed inside, feeling a little happy. This little joy was very childish. It was called, I know you. You don't know me. Tang Yu finally stood up and walked towards the bookshelf. The pure wool carpet absorbed the sound of his footsteps, so Pei Chi didn't notice him until he stood beside her. Her body stiffened. Tang Yu didn't speak. His slender fingers slid across the row of books and finally pulled out a thick book. Then, he stepped back a little. Pei Chi heaved a sigh of relief. She lowered her eyes and continued to wipe, however. He didn't really step back. He was almost standing behind her, and the distance was no more than 20 centimeters. When his hand passed over her shoulder and reached for the book again, Pei Chi could swear that every hair on her body was standing on end. Every cell in her body was also aware of his presence. She wanted to escape and move to the side. However, his shoulder was unexpectedly wide, and she almost fell on his body. Chapter 40. After a moment of panic, Pei Chi realized that his glasses had fallen off and fallen to the ground beside him. She awkwardly reached out to pick them up, but in this way, she was practically crushing Tang Yu's body. She seemed to have heard a muffled groan. After putting on her glasses with great difficulty, she realized that she was in such a rebellious position. Her eyes widened, and she was at a loss as to what to do. Now, should she knock him out or confess? To Tang Yu, it was torturous at this moment. Her entire body was pressed against his. He could feel her unbelievably soft body tightly pressed against his. The way she looked with her eyes open was very funny. Also, one of her legs was stuck right in between his two legs. Why aren't you getting up? Tang Yu's voice was unbelievably hoarse, as though he had a mouthful of hot sand in his mouth. Before Pei Chi could move, the door was pushed open. Xiao Ran stood at the door, holding a document in his hand as he looked at the scene in the office in surprise. The new working student come cleaner had pounced on the CEO? And years ago, there might have been female employees who dared to covet Tang Yu in Shengyuan cafeteria, but in the past 2 years, even the female fly in Shengyuan cafeteria knew that Tang Yu wasn't easy to get along with, and he was even a little hairy. She looked at him for a long time before slowly closing the door again. Giving face to the boss was equivalent to giving face to oneself. This was one of Xiao Ran's experiences in the workplace. Inside the office, Tang Yu glanced at the little one on top of him. His large hand reached over and patted her back lightly. His voice, however, was filled with the dignity of a superior. Get up. Pei Chi bit her lip. She couldn't care less about his inappropriate pat on her back anymore. She scrambled to get up, but during the process, their bodies touched and rubbed against each other in an indescribable way, stirring up the evil fire in Tang Yu's heart. Pei Chi stood up, and then she clearly saw Tang Yu's changes. She blushed and didn't know what to do. She thought to herself, Is his appetite too good? Tang Yu was a little annoyed. He stood up and glanced at her. That glance made Pei Chi-Chi's hair stand on end. Go inside and tidy yourself up. His voice was emotionless as he walked to his seat. Pei Chi-Chi immediately ran into the bathroom and looked in the mirror, only to find that her little face was blurry. When Xiao Ran came in again, he could no longer see Pei Chi-Chi. She placed the document on Tang Yu's desk and said softly, "President, it's a call from Mr. Tang. He wants to invite you back for dinner when you're free." Tang Yu's fingers paused. He looked up at Xiao Ran and asked calmly, "Which day am I free this week?" "There won't be a lot of schedule on Friday. Also, Miss Tang Xian has already called a few times to complain that you're not accompanying her." Xiao Ran's eyes were smiling. Tang Yu smiled. "Then the next time you ask her, why didn't she call me directly? Maybe she thinks it's more interesting to talk to me." Xiao Ran knew that when Tang Xian was mentioned, Tang Yu's mood would be better, and he was easier to get along with. Sure enough, Tang Yu only smiled and said nothing. When Xiao Ran left, he was still thinking about where the working student was now. Chapter 41. Xiao Ran had always thought that any woman who was involved with Tang Yu would be a lady from a prestigious family or a socialite's daughter. But apparently that was not the case. The door closed again, and Pei Chi-Chi came out. She had already put on her signature lipstick and did not dare to look at Tang Yu. She continued to work. The whole place was very quiet. Other than the faint sound of the air conditioning, there was only the rustling of documents and the sound of Pei Chi-Chi's footsteps on the carpet. At 5:00, Pei Chi-Chi walked to Tang Yu and said in a hoarse voice, "I'm off work." Tang Yu looked up at her and nodded. After Pei Chi-Chi left, Ming Qingchang came in. He had been staying in the office the whole afternoon. He closed the door and asked, "Did the young lady confess?" Lame. Tang Yu was still immersed in his documents. "Ming Qingchang, if you're really free, there is a project in Africa that is suitable for you." Ming Qingchang raised his hand and sat down on the table. He lowered his head and said, "Are you really addicted to playing? Last time, she was in professional attire. This time, she is a cleaner. What should she dress up as next time?" Tang Yu gave him a warning look. Ming Qingchang coughed lightly. "Are you serious now? Move her to the secretary's office on the top floor. Her working hours will still be from 3 to 5:00, but she doesn't need to do any cleaning work." Tang Yu instructed calmly. Ming Qingchang heard this and became serious again. "I told you she looks better in a uniform." Tang Yu only gave him a look before he packed his things and picked up his coat. Ming Qingchang followed him. "I heard from Xiao Ran that your old man called you to have dinner at the old mansion." Actually, the dinner was not an excuse. He was really going on a blind date for Tang Yu. Every time he went back, he would be in a bad mood because there would be a socialite with him. Tang Yu stopped in his tracks. "I will go back on Friday." Ming Qingchang knew that Tang Yu was willing to go back because he wanted to see Tang Xian. Even though they shared the same father but different mothers, Tang Yu didn't like Tang Ziyuan's new wife, Zhao Ku, but his love for Tang Xian was real. Unfortunately, Tang Xian had a chronic blood disease since she was young and had been waiting for a suitable bone marrow. "Why don't I go back with you? I haven't seen little Tang Xian for a long time." Ming Qingchang stopped joking and became serious. Tang Yu looked at him and walked into the elevator. He adjusted his tie in front of the mirror and said, "Tang Xian is only 16. She doesn't suit you." Her words hurt Ming Qingchang, making him feel uncomfortable as if his thoughts had been seen through. He followed him in and explained, "I just treat her as my sister. She is your sister, just like my sister." Tang Yu was unmoved. "Ming Qingchang, you have a sister." Ming Qingchang did not say anything. After a long time, he could not help but ask, "Where are you going tonight?" "Xia City." Tang Yu spat out 2 words. Ming Qingchang did not say anything. Pei Chi-Chi left Shengyuan. She received a call from Pei Huan on the bus. Pei Huan went straight to the point and did not give Pei Chi-Chi any time. "Jinrong and I are getting engaged next Saturday. Pei Chi-Chi, will you come?" Pei Chi-Chi held the phone and felt the malice from the whole world. How could she not know that this was Pei Huan's provocation? After a long time, she smiled. It was a faint smile, and there was no color on her face. However, she was always smiling. Chapter 42. Pei Huan said sarcastically, "Dad will be discharged from the hospital tomorrow. Jinrong will go with me to pick him up. Pei Chi, I won't stop you if you want to come." Pei Chi didn't listen anymore. She chose to hang up the phone. There was no air conditioning on this bus. It was hot and humid in the bus. Even if she sat by the window with the window open, she felt a wave of heat rushing over when the wind blew. It was very uncomfortable. Pei Chi felt that her nose was a little itchy and her head was a little dizzy. The bus stopped at a bus station near Xia City. She was supposed to go to a KFC across the road to change clothes, but her head was very dizzy and her feet were very painful. She changed in a nearby public toilet. When she came out, it was already dusk and the lights were dim. She was exhausted. At this time, she even had some depraved thoughts. Perhaps, if she attached herself to Tang Yu and was obedient to him, she could get a lot of things, which could save her a few decades of struggle. But that thought only lasted for a moment. She told herself that her name was Pei Chi. Except for Pei Ming and her, she would not betray herself again. While Pei Chi was in a trance, a wretched figure suddenly jumped out beside her. He had a mouth of big yellow teeth and spoke in an unknown dialect. "Sister, do you want to have fun with Uncle?" Pei Chi was shocked. Then, that terrifying face came closer. She could even feel the suffocating, heavy odor. It was very unpleasant. Pei Chi's hand slapped out fiercely. Then she grabbed her bag and ran forward with all her might. After running for about 100 meters, the big yellow teeth behind her didn't keep up. She couldn't help but turn her head. That dirty tramp was doing something indecent to her. Chi nearly vomited. She retched a few times and immediately ran into the gates of Xia City with quick steps. She was shocked with cold sweat. She slowly closed the door and saw Tang Yu sitting on the sofa. Pei Chi gasped and leaned against the door. At this time, she looked a little desperate. Tang Yu lifted his head and furrowed his brows. He walked over and placed his hand on her forehead. Pei Chi looked as if she had been scalded. She almost jumped up and said in a stern voice, "Don't touch me." His brows furrowed even deeper. He took a step forward and held her in his arms. Pei Chi's little chin rested on his shoulder, and she calmed down a little. His large palm patted her back. "What's wrong?" As their bodies pressed against each other, he felt that her body was a little hot. When he turned her face to look at it, he saw that it was abnormally red. Pei Chi looked up at him for a long time before slowly saying, "I met a pervert." He didn't ask. Instead, he hugged her and carried her to the bathroom. He held her with one hand and filled the bathtub with hot water with the other. When his fingers fell on her button, Pei Chi's little hand suddenly grabbed his big palm, silently protesting, "Am I a pervert?" Tang Yu didn't move his hand away. He raised his eyebrows and asked her. Pei Chi's little hand covered her neckline, and her watery eyes were filled with tears as she stared at him. Tang Yu's fingers moved her little hand away, and he focused on unbuttoning her shirt. "I'll do it myself." She lowered her eyes and said softly, "I still have that." Tang Yu just remembered. He smiled and got up. "Call me if you need anything." Chapter 43. After a while, she soaked her body in the warm water and stared at the splashes on the surface of the water, lost in her thoughts. Being sold to Tang Yu was different from what she had expected. She had thought that it would be humiliating, but, to her surprise, he wasn't that difficult to get along with. The experience was completely different from the female employees in Shangyuan, so it all depended on the face and figure. In fact, he was quite considerate. Pei Chi splashed water on her face, trying to wake herself up. She still caught a cold, and her nose kept snorting. Her face was pale, but her nose was red. When she came out, there were already 4 dishes and a soup on the dining table. It was a very light dish. Tang Yu sat at the dining table with a magazine in his hand. He looked at her, and then closed the magazine in his hand. His tone was a little faint. "I remember that you don't have classes after 3 p.m. Why are you back so late? I also remember that you said that you would only come over on Friday and Saturday. Why do I see you at home every day?" This was what Pei Chi thought in her heart, but she didn't dare to say it out loud. She sat down carefully. Her eyes were watery, and she was very careful. "I'm going to work." "Working?" Tang Yu picked up his chopsticks and ate as though he was just chatting with her. At this moment, he didn't feel any distance between them, and Pei Chi wasn't as nervous as before. She nodded her head. Yes. Tang Yu's face froze. I'll give you 100,000 yuan every month. His meaning was obvious. He didn't want her to show her face in public. Pei Chi bit her lips again. She held the chopsticks in her hand but didn't eat. I want to work. Her voice got even softer. He knew what she wanted even if she didn't say it. Tang Yu, on the other hand, looked very relaxed. He was in the mood to talk about life and ideals with this woman. You don't want to follow me for the rest of your life? Pei Chi looked at him and didn't say a word. Actually, even if she didn't say it, everyone knew that she wouldn't follow him forever. Not to mention that he would get married in the future. Even she herself would grow old and lose her beauty one day. When he was in his prime, she would no longer be young and fresh, and someone would replace her. You can go if you want, but I'll still give you a card to make sure your job is pleasant, he said. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes became hot, and she felt as if her throat was blocked. It was an indescribable emotion, even if it was insignificant to him. For her, it was the warmth that she rarely had in this world. Mr. Tang, she called out with difficulty, not because she was greedy, but because she really felt that he treated her well. Tang Yu put down the chopsticks in his hand and stroked her forehead with his large, slender palm. His voice was gentle and elegant. I can't say that my motive for being with you is noble, but I just take it that we're living together for a period of time, okay? Pei Chi looked at him. Tang Yu had his own reasons. He had never touched a woman before. Pei Chi was the first. Due to his identity, he had never considered marrying her. Perhaps at the beginning, he was not serious and did not treat her seriously. But now, he felt pity for her. But this was the only thing he could give her. In the end, he smiled. You can just call me Tang Yu in the future. Pei Chi nodded and lowered her head to eat. She had no appetite because of the cold, and Tang Yu didn't force her. He just told her to sleep early. Pei Chi took a cold medicine and lay down. She pulled the blanket up and looked outside to see if there were any lights on in the living room. Chapter 44. She fell asleep in a daze. After a long time, she felt a large palm on her forehead. Pei Chi called out Daddy in a daze. Tang Yu was stunned. He realized that she was calling out to Pei Mingyi. He had an impression of that man. He was a nice guy, but he wasn't smart enough. He wasn't cut out for business. He lay down according to her curves and reached out to pull her into his arms. His embrace was very warm, and Pei Chi curled up in it, looking like a small bird. Tang Yu didn't know if other men liked young girls, but when he looked at Pei Chi-Chi's appearance, he liked her very much. Her tender little face and her entire body was like a white lotus. Pei Chi-Chi slowly fell into a deep sleep in that embrace. When she woke up, Tang Yu was no longer there. She went to Shangyuan for the next 2 days, but she didn't see Tang Yu. There wasn't much to clean in the CEO's office. She just sat on the carpet and leaned against the bookshelf behind her, reading the books on it. But her little heart was still a little afraid that he would suddenly appear. Later, when she heard from Xiao Lu that the CEO had gone on a business trip, she heaved a sigh of relief and slacked off for 2 days. It was 4:00 in the afternoon on Friday. Meng Qingsheng wore sunglasses as he drove. He glanced at the rearview mirror and said, "Are we going back to the office or straight back to the mansion?" Tang Yu flipped through the documents and replied after a while, "Let's go back to the mansion." Meng Qingsheng was a little surprised. "Aren't you going back to see your sweetheart?" They hadn't seen each other for 2 days. Didn't he miss her? Actually, he really wanted to find out about Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi's affair, but he didn't have the guts. Tang Yu closed the documents and rolled down the car window. Meng Qingsheng couldn't help but say, "You said you didn't want to, but now you want to think of everything." Tang Yu ignored him and didn't tell him about his affair with Pei Chi-Chi. He was an old-fashioned man who didn't like to share his family matters with others. Not even Qingsheng could do that. Then, he furrowed his brows and remembered that he only wanted to spend one night with her. That night was when he was drunk. He had almost forgotten how it felt like, but he knew that it was a very addictive feeling. She opened the window and let her body, which had suddenly warmed up, cool down. The reason why she warmed up was because Qingsheng mentioned her. The limousine drove all the way to Yanhui's villa and stopped in front of the lawn. Meng Qingcheng jumped out of the car, and Tang Yu opened the door behind him. A servant had already come over to take the briefcase in his hand. Tang Yu walked briskly in front, followed by Meng Qingcheng. As they walked, he couldn't help but say, "Your father is really willing to spend money. This place looks like a palace. No one wants you to talk." Tang Yu's tone wasn't very good, but fortunately, Meng Qingcheng already knew that Tang Yu wouldn't be nice when they came here. As they spoke, a small body jumped into Tang Yu's arms, and her voice was also soft. "Brother." Tang Yu reached out and hugged the little girl in his arms for a while. Then he took her off his body and squatted down to look at her carefully. "You've grown taller again." Tang Xian pouted unhappily. "Brother, how long has it been since you came to see me? Aren't I here now?" Tang Yu reached out and patted her little head to comfort her. Chapter 45. Tang Yu and Meng Qingcheng both laughed out loud. "This little rascal." Meng Qingcheng teased her. "What about me? Have you counted how long it's been since you last saw your brother Qingcheng?" Tang Xian sighed. "Brother Qingcheng, you and I hate each other. Let's forget about it." Meng Qingcheng had a bitter look on his face. "So that's how you think of me? I'm so sad." He clutched his heart, looking delicate and weak. Tang Xian then reluctantly hugged him. "Be good." Tang Yu shook his head. Qingcheng looked like a playboy outside. How could he have known that he would fall in front of Tang Xian? He had never tried to stop or instigate them. Tang Xian was still young, and she was sick. Qingcheng would not ignore her. The few of them went to the living room. Tang Ziyuan and Zhao Ku were both there. In recent years, Tang Ziyuan had become more and more indifferent. He lived with Zhao Ku in Yanhui town. Tang Yu rarely came. He only came to see Tang Xian. Tang Ziyuan sat up straight when he saw him. "You're here? I'll tell the kitchen to serve the dishes." Zhao Ku patted the back of Tang Ziyuan's hand and smiled at Tang Yu. Tang Yu sat down. "It's still early. Let's wait a little longer." Zhao Ku was stunned. She quickly came back to her senses and smiled. "It's a little early. Have some fruits first." She personally cut a plate of fruits and placed it delicately. Tang Yu didn't move. He stood up and said calmly, "I'm going to take a shower." Tang Ziyuan didn't know what to do with him. He couldn't blame him for being too cold to his concubine. He could only say to Meng Qingcheng, "The child has grown up and doesn't return home. Qingcheng, you're even more hardworking than Tang Yu." Tang Yu, who was going upstairs, naturally heard it. He smiled coldly. That was because Meng Qingcheng wanted to hit on his daughter. He thought of Zhao Ku and the coldness in his eyes intensified. Home? What kind of family was this? Back then, Zhao Ku had used the seed in her belly to force his mother to leave and become the new wife of the Tang family. In the beginning, Sheng Yuan was funded by his mother's family, the Lin family. His mother, Lin Yun, and Tang Ziyuan worked together to build Sheng Yuan to where it was today. But when he was 10 years old, Zhao Ku walked into the Tang family and knelt in front of his mother to ask for permission. She was pregnant with Tang Ziyuan's child. Lin Yun stayed alone for a night and told Tang Ziyuan that she only had one request. She could divorce, but Zhao Ku couldn't touch Sheng Yuan no matter if it was a boy or a girl. Also, Tang Yu had to abdicate when Tang Yu was 22 years old. Otherwise, Zhao Ku's child could only be an illegitimate child. In order to protect the child in Zhao Ku's belly, Tang Ziyuan agreed without hesitation, which made Lin Yun feel even more hopeless. Of course, Zhao Ku was unaware of all of this. It was only when Tang Yu took over Sheng Yuan that Zhao Ku threw a tantrum for quite a while, but it was to no avail. Thinking about how Zhao Ku had been desperately trying to give birth to a son all these years, Zhang Xian could not help but feel a little ironic. It was true that Tang Yu loved Tang Xian, but it was also true that he had hurt Zhao Ku. When he finished showering and went downstairs, Meng Qingcheng was chatting with Tang Xian. She purposely said some funny things, and even Zhao Ku was laughing. The moment Tang Yu came downstairs, Meng Qingcheng immediately shut up. Zhao Ku's face froze for a moment. Then she said gently, "Let's eat." Tang Ziyuan also stood up. Tang Yu was not in the mood to make his new wife unhappy, so he went straight to the dining room. Chapter 46. Ever since she was young, She knew that her mother had taken away her brother's father, who was also her father, but her brother was very nice to her. He never gave her a bad look. Perhaps he pitied her because she was sick. After dinner, Meng Qingcheng couldn't find a reason to stay, so he said goodbye. Zhao Ke sent him out with a smile. Qingcheng, come and visit Tang Xian when you have time. She's lonely at home, she said with a hint of sadness. Although she was already close to 40 years old, she had maintained herself extremely well, and she was a top-notch beauty to begin with. Even Meng Qingcheng felt a sense of pity when he looked at her. He didn't know how Tang Yu was able to maintain playing poker for 10,000 years in front of such a face. Ani Zhao, I will. Meng Qingcheng smiled, not noticing that Zhao Ke's eyes twitched when she heard the word Ani Zhao. As the most beautiful woman in B City, how could she accept someone calling her Ani? Meng Qingcheng opened the car door and left. Tang Xian pestered Tang Yu to stay the night. After playing all kinds of childish games with her, he returned to his bedroom to deal with some work, but he couldn't help but think of Pei Chi-Chi. While he was distracted, there was a knock on the door. He paused and walked out, but it wasn't Tang Ziyuan who he thought it would be, but Zhao Ke. He quietly sized her up for a while. Zhao Ke was wearing a nightgown with a silk sling nightgown on the inside and a nightgown made of the same material on the outside. However, the belt around the waist was deliberately made very loose, so he could easily peek at her and spring. Zhao Ke held a glass of milk in her hand and smiled. Tang Yu, don't work too late. Sleep early. She handed the milk over. Tang Yu didn't take it. He still looked at her indifferently and said slowly, Does Tang Ziyuan know that you're dressed like this to go to your stepson's room? Zhao Ke was a little embarrassed. She covered her collar with one hand. Tang Yu, don't go too far. All of a sudden, he felt a little tired of looking at her and closed the door. Zhao Ke stood at the door, trembling with anger. She was the most beautiful woman in B City in her life, and only Tang Yu dared to look down on her like this. No, there's still that person. Zhao Ke pulled her hair, and a trace of unwillingness flashed through her eyes. After returning to the room, Tang Ziyuan was already asleep. Zhao Ke lay beside him, and Tang Ziyuan's hand immediately reached for her. It's getting late. She was a little disinterested. Tang Ziyuan was about to say something when he heard the sound of the door closing upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps going downstairs. He suddenly lost interest and sat up. It's so late. Is it Tang Yu? Zhao Ke sat up as well. She heard the sound of a car engine starting outside. Tang Yu had left. Tang Ziyuan sat there for a long time before sighing softly. Even now, he still hates me. Zhao Ke only felt that she had been slapped again. The previous slap was from Tang Yu, and this time, it was from Tang Ziyuan, but she didn't say anything. Tang Yu drove a low-key white Audi along Jiangbin Road and arrived at a residential area called Heyun Welfare. It was the place where his mother, Lin Yun, lived. It was a standalone villa. It was already late at night, and his mother was probably asleep. Tang Yu didn't want to disturb her. He just sat in the car and opened the window, smoking slowly. Chapter 47. Tang Yu got out of the car and looked at his mother in the morning light. She was wearing a white robe. Although she was almost 50 years old, she was still beautiful and elegant. She was different from Zhao Ke's flamboyant beauty. I came at night. I didn't want to wake you up. He went up and put his arm around his mother's shoulder, walking into the living room with her. Lin Yun looked at him. But you can't sit in the car. She had heard that Tang Yu went to Yin Hui's place yesterday. He probably couldn't stay there anymore, so he came here. She sighed in her heart. Although she prayed to Buddha, there were some things she couldn't let go. If she had let go, she wouldn't have let Tang Yu take over Shengyuan. Tang Yu smiled. I'll accompany you today. Lin Yun tilted her head. What do you want to eat? Shredded chicken noodles, Tang Yu said without thinking. Lin Yun patted him. You've been eating it since you were young. Go and wash it. It'll be done in a while. After Tang Yu went upstairs, Lin Yun looked at his back and thought to herself, Tang Yu is like her, he's always in love. He can love a bowl of noodles for so many years. Unlike Tang Yuan, Pei Chi-Chi was called out by Qin Xinjia on Saturday morning. At the People's Square, two girls in knee-length skirts were holding milk tea in their hands, watching the pigeons flying in the square. Qin Xinjia was worried for her. Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan are getting engaged. You're not worried at all. Pei Huan didn't invite anyone but Chun Xinjie and Pei Qiqi. Her intention was obvious. She wanted to humiliate Qiqi. Pei Qiqi shook her feet and looked down at the milk tea in her hand. Then she smiled. What's the rush? They're getting engaged. Chun Xinjie stared at her for a long time before asking, You don't like Lin Jinrong anymore? Pei Qiqi smiled. Her smile was a little pale. Xinjie, do you believe in fate? In the past, she had naively thought that she might be able to escape one day. But as Zhou Meilin often said, Pei Qiqi, you're just like your mother. Pei Qiqi didn't know what her mother was like. But now that she thought about it, she must have had a tragic life. She lowered her voice. Xinjie, I don't dare to think about these things. Chun Xinjie was stunned. Qiqi, did something happen to you? Pei Qiqi put the cup of milk tea aside. Nothing. Chun Xinjie was still unwilling to give up. I wonder what method Pei Huan used to sleep with Lin Jinrong. She said the last 3 words very softly and carefully looked at Pei Qiqi. Pei Qiqi's face was expressionless. Sleep? Didn't she sleep with Tang Yu too? Qiqi, you have to outshine Pei Huan at her wedding. Don't let her be too complacent, Chun Xinjie said angrily. Pei Qiqi jumped down the stairs. It's okay. Let's just be normal. Pei Huan really liked Lin Jinrong. What was the point of her fighting for him? Chun Xinjie couldn't help but sigh. Qiqi, you're really... Pei Qiqi patted her. After hanging out with Chun Xinjie for a long time, she went to visit Pei Mingyi in the afternoon while Pei Huan and Zhou Meilin were out shopping. Pei Mingyi was fine, but he couldn't help feeling a little sad when he looked at Pei Qiqi. Chapter 48. Upon hearing her voice, he opened his eyes and looked at her. Under the dim yellow light, his gaze seemed deep and unfathomable, as though there were some sparks clashing within it. Pei Qiqi's heart was beating a little quickly as she closed the door slowly. You're back? She looked at the luggage beside him and bit her lip. He had gone on a business trip. Did this mean that he would still be staying here from Monday to Sunday next week? Tang Yu sat up, his voice a little hoarse. Let's eat. I'm a little hungry. Pei Qiqi followed him to the dining room. The dining table was filled with dishes, and it was a little more sumptuous than usual. She could not help but think to herself, if I'm hungry, I can eat first. Tang Yu sat there without moving. Pei Qiqi scooped some rice for him embarrassedly before taking some for herself. Like a little wife, she sat beside him and ate slowly. After a few mouthfuls, he looked up at her. There was a meaning in those long and narrow eyes that she could not understand. Pei Qiqi's heart raced a little as she understood a little. After a long time, Tang Yu then asked indifferently, is it over? Pei Qiqi understood instantly. Her little face was dyed with a charming shade of pink, like a crystal jelly. She bit her lip until it was bright red and glistening. Her voice was especially soft as she said, It's over. Her head was lowered as though it was about to be buried in her bowl. Tang Yu looked at her deeply. Without saying anything, he continued eating. However, Pei Qiqi could not look forward to eating anymore. She felt as though she was a little lamb that was about to be eaten by a big bad wolf. After Tang Yu finished eating, he went to take a shower. He only said one sentence, Help me pack my luggage. Oh, okay. Pei Qiqi raised her head to look at him. That little face of hers looked a little aggrieved as it held a tinge of moisture. Tang Yu had already taken a step before he turned back and kissed her on the lips. However, he did not leave her lips immediately. His voice was a little warm as he said, Be good. Pei Qiqi could only look at him helplessly. That helplessness must have pleased him as he reached out and caressed her long hair. It was very soft as though it belonged to her. Pei Qiqi was so nervous that she was about to jump up. He smiled and let her off. She washed the dishes slowly and helped him arrange the clothes in his luggage into the changing room. The clothes had been dry cleaned and had a special, faint smell. Then, Pei Qiqi took a set of pajamas into the bathroom and washed it for half an hour before leaving. When she went out, she tugged at the skirt of the pajamas, feeling a little uncomfortable. This set of pajamas was prepared by him and was very sexy. In the bedroom, only the bedside lamp was turned on, and the light was dim. Tang Yu was wearing a bathrobe as he leaned against the headboard, one leg slightly bent. His body was slender and muscular, and he looked very good in the bathrobe. The collar was slightly loose, revealing his jade-like skin. Seeing Pei Chi come out, Tang Yu put down the magazine in his hand and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Come here." Pei Chi bit her lips and walked over slowly. She half knelt beside him, one hand on his knee and the other hanging by her side. She leaned forward and brought her little mouth over. It was messy and without any order. Tang Yu quickly pressed down on her little head and deepened the kiss. There was a faint taste of mint in his mouth, and it blended with her lemon taste, making him feel strangely comfortable. Chapter 49. Pei Chi bit his shoulder and said in a trembling voice, "Turn off the lights." Tang Yu looked down at her fragile state. Her pink eyelids were crystal clear from crying, and her long eyelashes were stained with 2 drops of tears that slid down with just a blink of an eye. Not only did he not turn off the lights, but he even turned them on and did it with her under the bright lights. Pei Chi cried even harder as she was bullied by him like that. However, he felt an indescribable sense of beauty. After one night, he was incomparably satisfied. Tang Yu indulged himself for a few nights in a row. Pei Chi was miserable. What happened to Friday and Saturday? Fortunately, Tang Yu transferred her to the archives room to clean and organize during work hours. Pei Chi would occasionally flip through those old cooperation cases and read them for a while. Her work was much more relaxed than before. Of course, she could also see Tang Yu's signature, which was strong and forceful. She didn't know what she was thinking about, but her face was a little red. On Friday night, when Tang Yu was handling work, she walked over and said softly, "I want to apply for leave tomorrow." Apply for leave? Tang Yu was a little amused. He raised his eyebrows and looked at her. What's the matter? He was a little worried that he had gone overboard these few days. So, Pei Chi replied, "I'll be back later." Tang Yu thought of the incident where she met the pervert last time. He put down what he was doing and looked at her seriously. "When you come back, I'll get the driver to pick you up." She was a little flattered, but she didn't want to. She couldn't bear his kindness. Looking down, Pei Chi's voice was very soft. "I'll just take a taxi back." Tang Yu didn't insist anymore. In his opinion, he was willing to pamper her a little, but Pei Chi was also an adult. She had legs. However, he didn't expect that one day he would pamper her so much that she didn't have legs. He also had an event tomorrow night. His cousin, Jinrong, was engaged, so he easily agreed to her request. Tang Yu was surprised. He heard from his mother that the girl was Jinrong's junior. Something must have happened, and the girl was a little forceful. Otherwise, it would be a big deal. After a lot of unpleasantness, they finally settled down. He looked at Pei Chi and couldn't help but think, if Pei Chi hadn't suffered from Zhou Meilin's persecution, would she have found someone as good as Jinrong? On Saturday, Pei Chi went with Chen Xinjia. Pei Chi was the woman's relative, but Zhou Meilin refused to acknowledge her identity. Therefore, Pei Chi's identity was very awkward in the Pei family. Pei Mingyi was very unhappy about this and felt that he had let down Pei Chi. He had also argued with Zhou Meilin, but Zhou Meilin had shut him down with a single sentence. "Pei Mingyi, do you want the Lin family to know that you have an illegitimate daughter?" Pei Mingyi quietly went upstairs and didn't mention it again. Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan's engagement ceremony was being held at the biggest GM hotel in B City. Zhou Meilin was smiling prettily in front of Pei Huan, as if she was the star of the night. The Lin family, on the other hand, was a lot more low-key and a lot more prominent. Zhou Meilin was very proud at first. After all, she had climbed up the social ladder. But slowly, the corners of her mouth drooped. Firstly, it was because Lin Jinrong didn't smile the whole night. Secondly, she couldn't speak to the relatives of the Lin family at all. Chapter 50. Pei Huan sharply looked at Lin Jinrong beside her. Indeed, his expression had changed. She snorted in her heart. He still treated Pei Chi as a goddess. In fact, Pei Chi had long been someone else's plaything. Pei Chi walked to the door and was stopped by a waiter. Pei Huan looked at her coldly. "I'm sorry, Mississippi. You have to wear an evening gown for tonight's banquet. Otherwise, you can't enter." The high-class waiter blocked her way with a polite smile on his face. Pei Chi was stunned. She looked up and saw Pei Huan's cold smile. Chen Xinjia, who was wearing a black gown, snorted. How can there be such a perverted rule? The waiter smiled but did not say anything. Zhou Meilin stood beside Pei Huan. She felt indescribably happy when she saw that bitch being blocked. She had been unhappy for more than 20 years. Now, she could finally vent her anger. Huan, I can't believe you came up with such a method. Zhou Meilin laughed. Pei Huan sneered without saying anything. She just watched Pei Qiqi make a fool of herself. To Pei Huan, Pei Qiqi was her nightmare. Ever since she was young, Pei Qiqi's grades were better than hers. She was prettier than her, and she was more popular with men than her. Even though Pei Qiqi never had new clothes to wear, Lin Jinrong frowned and was about to step forward. Pei Huan looked at him. Jinrong, I know you liked her, but are you going to embarrass me today? Get out of my way. Lin Jinrong's voice was a little cold, but Pei Huan did not move. At this moment, a voice sounded. What's going on? The waiter immediately became serious. Hello, Mr. Tang. GM was a business under Shang Yuan. Although Tang Yu did not come often, the staff here all knew him. Tang Yu was surprised to see his little pet. She was wearing a light pink dress, and her long hair was tied up into a princess's hairstyle. She was standing there quite comfortably, but he also realized that she did not have any decent jewelry on her. No wonder the waiter was making things difficult for her. What happened? This time, he lowered his voice and asked Pei Qiqi. Pei Qiqi was extremely shocked. Her eyes widened as she looked at Tang Yu. She did not expect to meet him here. After a long time, she finally came back to her senses. She wrung her hands and said softly, I'm not wearing an evening gown. No one had told her beforehand. Tang Yu looked at her, then glanced at Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan. He had roughly figured out their relationship. Jinrong had actually married Pei Qiqi's younger sister, but he had such a mother. There was a touch of coldness in his eyes. Then he said in a calm voice, She is my companion. The waiter was stunned. Zhou Meilin was stunned. Pei Huan was also stunned. But the one who was most shocked was Lin Jinrong. Big brother Tang Yu actually knew Pei Qiqi. He recalled what Pei Qiqi had said. She was with someone else, and that person could give her anything. Was it Tang Yu? His cousin? Lin Jinrong did not speak for a long time. Pei Huan could not help but want to point out the relationship between Pei Qiqi and Tang Yu. Zhou Meilin pulled her back and said in a low voice, Do you want everyone to know that the Pei family sold Pei Qiqi? Pei Huan did not act rashly anymore. She was not reconciled. Mom, are we just going to let that money-losing person take advantage of us? Zhou Meilin looked at the movement over there. At this moment, Tang Yu gave her a look. She trembled and said, Don't worry, there will be opportunities in the future. Chapter 51. Chen Xinjia gulped down her saliva. Gosh, when did Pei Qiqi catch such a huge golden turtle? She hurriedly followed and even made a face at Pei Huan. Pei Huan's face turned pale from anger and Zhou Meilin nearly fainted. Pei Qiqi's hand was held by Tang Yu. She lowered her head and did not dare to look at anyone. She knew clearly that with Tang Yu's power, he would definitely be the center of attention right now. She struggled but could not break free. He used his strength to hold her down and looked down at her. Listen to me. Pei Qiqi smiled weakly and only let go of her hand when they were in front of Lin Jinrong. Pei Huan stood side by side with Lin Jinrong. Even though she was gritting her teeth in hatred, she thought about it. So what if Pei Qiqi got Tang Yu's love for a short period of time? Tang Yu would never marry her. Moreover, Pei Qiqi was still in love with Lin Jinrong. That was the most humiliating part for her. Pei Huan's fingers rested on Lin Jinrong's arm. She looked very obedient. Jinrong, can you introduce me? Lin Jinrong's gaze swept past Pei Qiqi's face and eventually landed on Tang Yu's face. After a while, he said, This is my cousin, Tang Yu, the CEO of Shengyuan. Pei Huan's eyes were filled with surprise. She liked Lin Jinrong, his looks and his family background. However, when the super diamond-studded CEO of Shengyuan stood in front of her, she felt a little dizzy. She was still rather rational. She was engaged to Lin Jinrong, and a man like Tang Yu was not easy to handle. Hence, she stretched out her hand and said fawningly, Then I'll call you Brother Tang Yu from now on. However, Tang Yu did not reply, nor did he stretch out his hand. Pei Huan's hand remained there for a long time, looking embarrassed. She smiled stiffly and looked at Pei Chi. What a coincidence. Pei Chi is my half-sister. Tang Yu was finally willing to look at her. He smiled faintly and said, I can't tell. Pei Huan was overjoyed, but Tang Yu added, I thought Chi would be younger than you. Pei Huan could not even squeeze out a smile. After a while, he finally managed to hold it in and raised his eyebrows. Chi, have you prepared a gift for me? Pei Chi took out a box from her small bag. Pei Huan took it and was not interested in looking at it. Anyway, it could not be anything valuable. After Pei Chi was done, Chun Xinjia also gave her present, but it was for Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong reached out and took it. His gaze landed on Chun Xinjia's face. He remembered that he had passed the invitation to Qin Xinjia during the birthday party and asked her to pass it to Pei Chi. Why did it end up in Pei Huan's hands? However, all of that was no longer important now. Qin Xinjia raised her head and looked at Lin Jinrong deeply. Senior, I wish you happiness. Happiness? Lin Jinrong laughed at himself. With Pei Huan? Pei Huan looked at Qin Xinjia and was very unhappy. Why was she looking at Jinrong with such a pitiful expression? Just as the atmosphere was getting tense, a gentle voice rang out. Tang Yu, why aren't you going over? Chapter 52. Her intuition told her that this was Tang Yu's mother. Sure enough, Tang Yu called out. Lin Yun smiled. Your uncle is over there. Tang Yu nodded and looked at Pei Chi. Don't run around. Only Pei Chi could understand the look in his eyes. He wanted to say, be obedient. Lin Yun didn't notice Pei Chi at first. This was the first time she saw her son so attentive to a girl. She couldn't help but take a second look, and then her expression froze. They were too alike. Lin Yun's eyes were glued to her, and she didn't move for a long time. Tang Yu's hand gently touched her elbow. His mother had never lost her composure. Pei Chi felt extremely uncomfortable under Lin Yun's gaze. She couldn't help but feel a little guilty. After all, she was bought by Tang Yu. Lin Yun snapped back to reality and smiled at Pei Chi. You look good. If Pei Chi and Tang Yu didn't have this kind of relationship, she might have treated Lin Yun as a respectable elder. But they did, so she didn't know how to respond. It seemed that no matter what she did, it would be a little awkward. In the end, she could only smile. Lin Yun walked with her son and asked casually, What's the girl's name? Do you know her? Of course, Tang Yu knew what his mother wanted to know, so he said, Mom, Pei Chi is Pei Huan's older sister. Lin Yun nodded and seemed to be relieved. She didn't ask any more questions. After they left, Lin Jinrong also went over. Pei Huan looked at Pei Chi and snorted. Don't embarrass yourself at the ball later without an evening gown. Really, she thought that Pei Chi wouldn't be able to get in, but who knew that Tang Yu would come over? Pei Chi looked around. Indeed, she was the only one without an evening gown, and she looked a little out of place. She smiled lightly. Pei Huan, what are you afraid of? Pei Huan glared at her. Pei Chi, do you think I'm afraid of you? You're just... Before he could finish, Zhou Meilin pulled him back and reprimanded him in a low voice. Do you not want to live anymore? Pei Huan gritted her teeth and said, Mom, I just can't stand her pretending to be aloof. Zhou Meilin was about to say something when a saleswoman came over and stood next to Pei Chi. She said politely, Miss Pei, Mr. Tang has asked you to come with me to try on the clothes. Pei Huan was about to go crazy. Zhou Meilin was also dumbfounded. She kept muttering in a low voice, Isn't it just spending money to buy it? Is there a need to be so concerned? She repeated it over and over again, but it was Pei Huan who stopped her. Mom, what are you saying? Zhou Meilin snapped out of her daze. In the past, half of her jealousy and hatred towards Pei Chi was because of Pei Chi's mother, and the other half was because of Pei Huan. But now, it was for herself. As a woman, she had never received Pei Mingyi's love, even though that man had been a yes-man to her all his life and could not hold his head up high. Although Pei Huan and Jinrong were engaged, they had obtained it through underhanded means. It was hard to say what would happen in the future. But now that Pei Chi had received Tang Yu's love, Zhou Meilin was a little jealous. Pei Chi looked up and saw Tang Yu standing there casually. There was a faint and gentle smile in his eyes. Chapter 53. Pei Chi thought that he would prepare a gown for her, but she was stunned when she entered. There were 2 rows of gowns, all of which were the latest products of Van XYS. This brand appealed to young girls, and it was very romantic. Pei Chi reached out to touch it, and it would be a lie to say that she didn't feel anything. In the lounge, there were 2 professional designers who smiled and introduced to Pei Chi. "Miss Pei, this spring summer gown should suit you very well." Pei Chi looked over and saw that it was a mid-length gown made of white chiffon. The simple design highlighted the waistline, and the skirt was made of interwoven pink and green flowers. It was a beautiful sight to behold. She nodded, and the waiter helped her change into it, and then picked a pair of high heels of the same style. Her long black hair was draped over her shoulders, and there was no need for any makeup. "Miss Pei, this gown really suits you." The waiter smiled, full of admiration. Wearing this set of clothes, Pei Chi looked like a sprout that had just sprouted in spring, white and incomparably fresh. Even she herself had never thought that she would have such a beautiful way of looking. "Mr. Tang." The door opened, and Tang Yu came in, and the waiter greeted him respectfully. Pei Chi turned around. Just like that, she stood there fresh and beautiful, tender and incomparably beautiful. Tang Yu gestured for the others to leave, and after the door closed, he walked over slowly. Pei Chi was a little nervous, and she looked at him, not daring to move. Tang Yu's large palm held onto her slender waist and brought her to the full-length mirror. The entire mirror reflected their figures. Pei Chi stood in front of him helplessly, and he was almost hugging her in his arms. His lips were a little scorching as he touched her soft shoulders. His voice was a little hoarse. "Very beautiful." Pei Chi's voice was fluttering. She did not dare to look at the mirror, and she bit her lips. "Thank you." He chuckled and let go of her. Turning her around, he took out a diamond necklace from his pocket and wrapped it around her slender wrist. A young girl's arms were as white as the first snow. Anything would look good on her, not to mention a diamond bracelet that weighed more than 40 carats. Pei Chi felt that it was too precious. Instinctively, she shrank back and was pulled into his arms. His face was buried in her hair, and his voice was unbelievably hoarse. "Then thank me properly tonight." She buried herself in his arms, trembling pitifully like a newborn animal. Tang Yu smiled and reached out to pull her out. He kissed her forehead. "Let's go out together." She was hesitant, but Tang Yu had already held her little hand and walked out. At this time, it was very lively outside. Lights intertwined, and clothes fluttered in the dance. All kinds of beauties competed for beauty, jewels, and husbands. It was also Pei Huan's most proud moment. No matter what, Lin Jinrong's first dance was also hers. After tonight, she would be the future Mrs. Lin. Pei Huan leaned on Lin Jinrong's shoulder, a little intoxicated, and enjoyed the envy of others. However, when Pei Chi and Tang Yu walked out, Tang Yu was already very eye-catching, and when he walked out with Pei Chi, he was like a 360-volt light bulb. Chapter 54. That girl was really beautiful. Her waist was slender, her skin was fair, and her face. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she could topple an entire city. "Do you know how to dance?" Tang Yu pulled her into his arms and asked in a low voice. Pei Chi was a little nervous. She lowered her gaze and said, "A little." But now that she was wearing high heels, she didn't know if she would step on his feet. As it turned out, Pei Chi, who danced in high heels for the first time, was a trap. Before the dance was over, Tang Yu's feet had already been stepped on 4 or 5 times. She lowered her little face. Her face was very hot, and she kept apologizing. Tang Yu couldn't stand her like this. He simply carried her up and placed her on his leather shoes. He took her away. Pei Chi was stunned for a moment. Wouldn't this be a little too close? And others would see. "For the sake of my feet, don't move." His voice rang beside her ear. It was a little hot and numb. She was pressed into his arms. Pei Chi didn't dare to move. She only looked up and saw Lin Jinrong's cold gaze. He looked at her with an unreadable expression. To Lin Jinrong, tonight was not a good night. On the night of his engagement, the girl he liked got together with his cousin. Pei Huan glared at Pei Chi-Chi. She wanted to eat her up. The engagement ceremony of her dreams, where she wanted to trample Pei Chi-Chi under her feet even in her dreams, was gone so easily. Pei Chi-Chi only danced with Tang Yu once, for the sake of his feet. But after that, Tang Yu didn't dance with anyone else. He stood not far away from her, socializing with a group of business elites. Tonight, he was a little different from usual. Although Tang Yu was usually elegant and noble, he always restrained his elegance and wasn't as wanton as tonight. He was the center of attention just by standing there with a glass of red wine. Pei Chi-Chi looked away and whispered to Chen Xinjia, "I'm going to the washroom." Chen Xinjia was completely dumbfounded today. She nodded blankly. Pei Chi-Chi lifted the hem of her dress and walked into the washroom. When she came out, she had to walk through a long hallway. The light refracted from the gorgeous crystal chandelier hit her little face, leaving a shadow. Lin Jinrong stood quietly in front of him. Pei Chi-Chi stood still and looked up. She was a little startled, and her mouth opened slightly. They were a few steps apart, but between them were Pei Huan and Tang Yu. There was also the fondness that he couldn't express in time. Lin Jinrong pursed his lips and looked at Pei Chi-Chi with an inexplicable gaze. After a long time, he finally said, "Are you with him?" Until now, he still felt that it was unreal. Tang Yu was the god in Lin Jinrong's heart. He was almost the representative of a man who didn't get close to women. How could he use such a method to be with Pei Chi-Chi? He really didn't dare to believe it, and he didn't want to believe it. To Pei Chi-Chi, it was embarrassing. No matter how much glory Tang Yu had given her today, she was still a woman he had bought. She curled her lips, and there was an indescribable vividness in her little face. She said to him, "Lin Jinrong, don't I have good taste? Tang Yu treats me very well and dotes on me. You've seen it for yourself." She pretended to be nonchalant, but Lin Jinrong couldn't take it anymore. His face darkened. "But he won't marry you." Chapter 55. If Big Brother Tang Yu was serious about her, he would be willing to accept it. But obviously, he wasn't. If it was really important, then he would introduce her to their relatives, or at least his aunt, Lin Yun. Lin Jinrong saw it much more clearly than Pei Huan and Zhou Meilin. Pei Chi-Chi's face was a little pale, but she still smiled. "It's okay. I know." Her smile finally settled, and it slowly froze on her little face. "Lin Jinrong, I've already gotten enough by following Tang Yu, even if it's only for a year or two. I'm not that ambitious, so you don't have to worry about me anymore, and don't judge me by the standards of a saint," because she had never had a choice. If she had, she wouldn't lose him. Pei Chi-Chi smiled faintly and tilted her head slightly. "Lin Jinrong, I wish you happiness." With that said, she walked forward, and when she brushed past him, he wanted to catch her. He even had the bolder thought of taking her away, but Lin Jinrong didn't. He just stood there, feeling her hair brushing past his shoulder, very lightly. It was just like that year when she stood under the maple tree, and he saw her with one glance. They brushed past each other. Lin Jinrong stood there for a long time, so long that he laughed at himself. "Lin Jinrong, I wish you happiness." After the banquet ended, Tang Yu asked the chauffeur to send his mother away, and he turned to look at Pei Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi came with Chen Xinjia, and at this moment, Chen Xinjia was nowhere to be found. She stood alone at the entrance of the hotel, looking a little pitiful. Tang Yu opened the car door and got the chauffeur to drive the car in front of her, and the car window rolled down. "Get in." Pei Chi-Chi looked at him, unable to say anything to reject him, so she opened the car door and got in. This was her first time sitting in the back seat of a car with him. Only after sitting in the back seat did she feel that the back seat of the car was especially narrow and cramped. He had also drunk some wine, so the slight tipsy feeling permeated the entire car, leaving her with nowhere to escape. Pei Chi-Chi sat obediently with her hands on her knees. Tang Yu closed his eyes to rest for a while. After a while, he felt a little hot, so he loosened his tie and ordered her in a low voice, "Unbutton my shirt." Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. She didn't know if he was going to unbutton his suit or his shirt, but if he didn't say it explicitly, she would rather take off his suit. Her small hands reached over and carefully unbuttoned his jacket, leaving it open on both sides. Tang Yu opened his eyes and put his big hand on the back of her head. His voice was a little hoarse. "Are you afraid that I'll do something to you in the car?" Pei Chi did not dare to move. Her face was almost buried in his waist. She shook her head and then quickly nodded. Tang Yu smiled and patted her gently. "Even if I want to do something, I have to consider what's ahead." Pei Chi's face blushed. Luckily, he couldn't see it because it was dark in the car. She sat up straight, not daring to speak to him. Her little face was also looking out of the car window, looking at the bustling city. Those lights flashed by, dazzling her eyes. But after a long time, she felt an indescribable loneliness. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She was actually just like those lights. Beautiful, but only for a moment. A big hand carried her up and placed her in his arms. Pei Chi was a little stiff. His face was buried in her little neck, and his voice was very soft. "Don't move. I want to sleep for a while." When he said that, she really did not dare to move. After a while, her neck was so stiff that she could no longer move. Tang Yu was not asleep either. He was just resting. When he opened his eyes and saw her like that, he found it both infuriating and funny. "Idiot." She looked down. "You're the one who told me not to move." Tang Yu chuckled and ordered in a hoarse voice, "Then kiss me now." Pei Chi raised her little face and looked at him. Her eyes were wet. He couldn't stand such a little gaze. He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. Chapter 56. There was a faint taste of alcohol in his mouth. It was very fragrant and mellow. Pei Chi felt dizzy. Slowly, she wrapped her little hands around his neck. Tang Yu released her with difficulty and hugged her in his arms. Pei Chi buried her little face in his chest and heard the loud thumping sound. He seemed to be unable to endure it. Pei Chi's little face was distorted, and it was difficult for her to breathe. Pei Chi shook her little head in protest, but he still held her down. She had no choice but to bite him, with only a thin layer of his shirt between them. It was even messier now. Pei Chi's hair was pulled up forcefully, and her little face was forced to look up at him helplessly. Her eyes were filled with tears. Tang Yu held her little waist and lowered his head to kiss her again. The car was filled with the smell of alcohol and passion. The poor driver sat in front and didn't dare to move, afraid that he would ruin Mr. Tang's plans. Tang Yu still had a shred of clarity left in him. No matter how much he wanted to do it, he left it for when they got home. Half hugging her, he kissed her as he kicked the bedroom door shut. He held her little face and said hoarsely, "I can't wait anymore." Pei Chi collapsed weakly against the door. Her eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of white moonlight. After it was over, Tang Yu buried his head in her neck and panted. He had never been so impulsive before. When he calmed down, he looked down at the person in his arms. Her long hair was messy, and her little body was trembling. No matter how he looked at it, he was the one who bullied her. "Chi-Chi." His voice was hoarse as he called out her name. Pei Chi bit her lip and was still daydreaming 1,000 miles away. Her long eyelashes were stained with 2 teardrops, which made her look lovable. She was a little cold now. Her little hands subconsciously hugged his neck, and she buried herself in his arms. "Tang Yu, it's cold." She buried her face in his neck and said softly. Tang Yu exhaled with difficulty. Only then did he realize that his hot sweat had cooled down. He reached out and carried her to the bathroom. Tonight, of course, wasn't enough. There was still a long night ahead, so long that she didn't have time to mourn her lost love. When Pei Chi woke up, it was already 10:00 the next morning. When she opened her eyes, she saw a handsome face. Her heart skipped a beat, and she was a little surprised that he hadn't gotten out of bed yet. He was very good-looking, and when she looked at him from such a magnified view, it was even more stunning. In particular, his nose was especially tall, like that of a nobleman. In addition, his lips were thin and elegant. Usually, he looked a little strict, but now, he seemed to be much younger and gentler. Thinking back to last night, Pei Chi pursed her lips and blushed. She wanted to get up, but a large palm pulled her into his embrace. Her little hand happened to be resting on his shoulder. She wanted to get up, but a large palm brought her into his arms. Her little hand happened to be resting on his shoulder. "You're awake?" Tang Yu's voice was low and husky. He caught her little mouth and bit it. She let out a low cry. He smiled and hugged her tightly, as if he was hugging a little toy. Sigh. A young girl was so small and so cute. He almost couldn't let go of her. He never knew that this kind of thing could be so interesting. "What should I do?" He smiled and deliberately teased his little friend. "Pei Chi-Chi, I'm exhausted," he said and reached out to pinch her little face. Pei Chi-Chi's face became even hotter and she didn't dare to look at him. Chapter 57. Tang Yu grabbed her little hand and touched the bite marks she had left on him last night. Then, he raised his eyebrows. "You like to bite people?" "No." Pei Chi-Chi bit her lip. "You were pressing down on me last night, so I bit it." Tang Yu watched her explain seriously, but in his heart, he was thinking, if I press her there next time, will she also bite there? But he kept thinking about it and didn't put it into action. He let go of her and got up, saying mildly, "Make noodles for me later." Pei Chi-Chi made an O sound. She wanted to ask him why he loved chicken noodles so much, but she didn't dare to ask. They skipped breakfast and went straight to lunch. Other than chicken noodles, she also made 2 stir-fry dishes. Tang Yu looked at them. Although he didn't say anything, he ate a lot, as a form of praise for her culinary skills. Today was Sunday. Tang Yu didn't go out. He sat on the sofa and flipped through a magazine instead of dealing with work. Since he didn't go out, Pei Chi-Chi could only accompany him and sit on the other side of the sofa. In the end, she was too tired. Her little head tilted to one side, and she slowly fell asleep on the sofa. The sunlight from outside shone into the living room through the glass, gilding the people inside. The sofa, the young girl, the handsome man. Everything was beautiful and tranquil like a painting. Tang Yu looked up and stared blankly at the sleeping Pei Chi-Chi. He didn't have much of an expression on his face, but there was a rare gentleness in his dark eyes. His slender and good-looking fingers let go of the magazine. He stood up, walked over, and looked down at her. Her small face was as fresh as a painting. She was wearing a pure white dress, and the fabric of the dress clung to her curves. It was beautiful and moving. But how could a girl like her cook well? Tang Yu sat beside her and reached out to hold her little hand. Her skin was fair and soft, but there were some calluses on her palm. Although they weren't rough, it meant that she had to do housework. He thought of Zhou Meilin's attitude towards her. She must have had a hard time. Tang Yu looked at her for a long time before he gently carried her to the bedroom. Only he knew that he couldn't let go of her. At the very least, it went against his original intentions. On Monday, it was also Tang Yu who sent her to school. Originally, Pei Chi-Chi wouldn't have made it in time, but a certain man suddenly became interested at 7:30 in the morning. In the end, he put his watch on the bedside table and counted the time. Pei Chi-Chi sat in the car. Her legs were still soft, and her face was bright red. Her whole body looked soft. Tang Yu drove and threw a paper bag to her. "Breakfast." Pei Chi-Chi tilted her head and glanced at him, then pursed her lips and ate in small bites. She didn't say anything, but in fact, she was protesting. As an inexperienced girl, she really couldn't stand his stare so early in the morning. Tang Yu obviously knew it, but he just didn't plan to change it. If everything between a man and a woman had to be done step by step, then what was the point of it? The high-performance sports car stopped at the entrance of B University. Pei Chi-Chi opened the car door and got out, but he stopped her. "Chi-Chi." She was stunned, because this was the first time Tang Yu had called her that. Pei Chi-Chi turned her head and looked at him. Tang Yu smiled. "I'll be home at around 7 today. Remember to cook." Chapter 58. He was being considerate by telling her that he was going home, so that she would have enough time to go back and change her clothes. Pei Chi-Chi only came back to her senses after a long while and replied, "Mm." He smiled and waved for her to come over. Pei Chi-Chi walked over slowly with the unfinished breakfast in her hand. Tang Yu took the bag from her hand and hooked her little head, biting her lips. "Go home early." Pei Chi-Chi's eyes felt a little hot. She no longer had a home, but now, the man who bought her was telling her to go home early. Was that their home? She did not know. All she knew was that they would not be together forever. She lowered her eyes and replied, "Mm." She watched as he drove away. When she retracted her gaze, she saw Shinjia standing opposite her with her phone in her hand. Since they were quite a distance apart, Pei Chi could not see her expression clearly. "Chi, here, here." Shinjia ran over, her voice filled with excitement. Before she could stop, she gave Pei Chi a punch. "Little girl, that Bugatti just now belonged to Tang Yu?" Pei Chi did not really want to talk about this. She was thinking that she should not sit in his car in the future because it was too conspicuous. The two of them walked into the school together. Pei Chi did not say a word while Shinjia walked in front of her. She walked backward and asked mysteriously, "Is that so?" Pei Chi still did not say a word and merely shook her head. "I know, it is." Shinjia turned around and walked side by side with her. She then counted her fingers. "Does Tang Yu know that you're still working at Shengyuan?" Pei Chi looked at her and said softly after a long while, "I don't think so." "Shinjia, please don't tell anyone." "Don't worry. What kind of relationship do we have?" Shinjia's eyes were filled with misgivings. "Wow, so you and him have negative distance contact?" "Negative distance contact?" Pei Chi blushed after she figured it out. After a while, she snorted, "Nonsense." Shinjia was about to say something when Pei Chi saw Pei Huan. Pei Huan's face was cold. She looked at them and sneered, "You're just a mistress. Pei Chi, you're really shameless." Pei Chi's eyes froze. She stood there and looked at Pei Huan. She didn't know how someone could be so shameless. Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan were now enjoying the riches and honor of selling herself to Tang Yu, but they were using a superior attitude to humiliate her. Sometimes, she wondered if their brain circuitry was normal. Pei Chi's face was cold. "Pei Huan, I can also be completely shameless. Do you need me to tell Lin Jinrong what you and your mother have done?" A hint of hatred appeared in Pei Huan's eyes. She was originally riding the crest of success, but Pei Chi stole the limelight at the engagement party on Saturday, and she, the bride-to-be, became a foil to her. Especially that night, when she wanted to be alone with Lin Jinrong. She wanted to be pregnant with his child. She had to tie Jinrong down. There couldn't be any variables. She couldn't wait for graduation. The way Jinrong looked at Pei Chi made her feel a little scared. However, Lin Jinrong rejected her. Even though he was drunk, he still wasn't interested in her. She kissed him for a long time, but he said in a cold voice, "Pei Huan, I can't get hard on you without the medicine." Pei Huan was shocked. She thought that he had fallen asleep, but he wasn't. Chapter 59. At that moment, Pei Huan almost broke down. With a trembling voice, she asked him why he still had to take responsibility even if he knew. Pei Huan would remember until the day she died. Jin Rong sat on the bedside, looking at her with an extremely indifferent gaze. He smiled bitterly, "Pei Huan, because I've slept with you, she won't want me anymore." So, it didn't matter who she was with or who she married. But Pei Huan understood that this was Lin Jinrong's revenge. He was willing to marry her, but there would be no love. He wouldn't even give her the most basic warmth. She should give up, but she couldn't bear to give up the position of young madam of the Lin family. Since that was the case, let's see who had the last laugh. Wasn't Pei Chi the white moonlight in his heart? If that Pei Chi was a bad person, would Lin Jinrong still think of her as pure as jade? Pei Huan looked at Pei Chi and laughed coldly. "My mom promised you to Mr. Zhong, and he was willing to marry you. But what have you done now? You've become Tang Yu's mistress." Shinjia jumped up. "I've never seen such an ugly table manners. Even a dog is better than you." Pei Huan glared at her. "Aren't you just a dog by Pei Chi's side?" Shinjia wanted to continue arguing, but Pei Chi stopped her. She looked at Pei Huan and smiled faintly. "Yes, I'm being cheap. But Pei Huan, there's still a long way to go. I hope that you can live a peaceful life." With that said, she pulled Shinjia and left quickly. "Chi, are we just going to let it go? She's the shameless one." Lin Jinrong. Shinjia looked at her and said indignantly, but she was interrupted by Pei Chi. "Forget it." The two came to a rooftop. Pei Chi stood there, and looked at the scenery in the distance. She felt cold all over. Qin Xinjie said softly, "Then, you've really become Tang Yu's mistress?" Pei Qiqi gazed into the distance. After a long time, she finally chuckled. "Yes." Qin Xinjie was stunned. Pei Qiqi turned around and looked at Qin Xinjie. "Xinjie, are you looking down on me now?" "Qiqi, you must have your reasons," Qin Xinjie said hesitantly. Pei Qiqi looked down and said softly, "I have my reasons, but it's not like I have no choice." She said, almost self-deprecatingly, "I can be the wife of an old man and live a relatively respectable life." However, Pei Qiqi knew that Mr. Zhong would probably abandon her after 2 or 3 years. She really didn't know what would happen to her after that. Zhou Meilin was afraid of Tang Yu, and so was Mr. Zhong. For Pei Qiqi, Tang Yu was the best safe haven. He wanted her body, and she wanted his protection. Qin Xinjie digested all of this with difficulty. All of this was beyond her mental endurance. She looked at Pei Qiqi and gripped the phone in her hand tightly. On the phone, there was a photo of Pei Qiqi and Tang Yu. She had wanted to show it to Pei Qiqi, but now there was probably no need. She even regretted staying with Pei Qiqi at Shengyuan Academy. Now, Pei Qiqi's relationship with Tang Yu. Qin Xinjie's heart was in a mess, and at the same time, she felt very complicated. Pei Qiqi clearly knew Tang Yu. Why didn't she tell her? "Qiqi, I want to accompany you to Shengyuan Academy to be a working student." Qin Xinjie hesitated for a moment before saying. Chapter 60. Oh, Qin Xinjie was a little disappointed. After all, this was her only chance to get to know the higher-ups of Shengyuan. After a while, she asked again, "Qiqi, will you stay in Shengyuan in the future?" Pei Qiqi walked down from the rooftop and patted her dress. She shook her head slowly. No, she would not be Tang Yu's mistress for the rest of her life. She would not allow herself to be like that either. Qin Xinjie did not say anything else and followed her to the classroom. At 2:30 p.m., Pei Qiqi carried her bag and boarded the bus. Qin Xinjie stood at the platform and waved her hand. When the bus drove away, her hand was still waving in the air for a long time. By the time Pei Qiqi arrived at Shengyuan, it was already 3:05 p.m. She changed her clothes and entered the archive room immediately. There was usually no one there. Occasionally, Tang Yu would come by, but that was just what she heard. Until now, she had never seen Tang Yu come here. Pei Qiqi was a design student and had no interest in these boring numbers. She spread out a piece of newspaper and sat on the ground. She sorted the documents one by one and labeled the folders outside. It was quiet all around, and she felt at ease. When Tang Yu walked in, he saw Pei Qiqi sitting on the ground. Her face was lowered, and her fingers were moving nimbly. Looking at her reminded him of the way she made shredded chicken noodles. She was so docile. Of course, it would be better if she did not have that pair of glasses on her face. Today, she probably forgot to put on her lipstick, or because she felt safe here. Her lips were fresh and clean. "President," Xiao Ran called out softly from behind. Tang Yu raised his hand, and Xiao Ran understood immediately. He retreated to the side and stood guard outside. Tang Yu went in and closed the door behind him. When Pei Qiqi heard the sound, she raised her head. The expression on her face was a little confused, and she looked quite cute. Tang Yu just glanced at it, then walked past her and went in, looking for the documents he wanted on the bookshelf. Pei Qiqi immediately stood up and waited behind him like a primary school student. Tang Yu smiled. His fingers searched through the bookshelf, but he couldn't find it after a long time. He thought for a while and asked Pei Qiqi, "Where are the documents from March 2011? Pei Qiqi was startled, and she replied reflexively, "On the leftmost side of the 3rd floor." Tang Yu smiled, then turned his face sideways. "Pei Qiqi, go get it for me." Pei Qiqi was stunned. He called her. "Pei Qiqi?" He recognized her. Pei Qiqi's eyes widened, and she swallowed hard. She kept backing away, looking very pitiful. Tang Yu hooked her chin. "Come here." Pei Qiqi was still standing there. She pursed her lips and said softly, "How did you know about me?" Still in a dilemma? Tang Yu dragged her over. "Help me find it." Pei Qiqi looked for the documents he was looking for mechanically, but his fingers didn't leave her. Instead, he held onto her slender waist, and she was almost leaning on his shoulder. Tang Yu was very tall, and this made her look especially slender. Pei Chi tiptoed, took the documents down, and handed them to him. She was still being hugged. Tang Yu's hands went around her to hold the documents, trapping her in the middle. They looked at the documents in this position. Pei Chi felt very uncomfortable, but she didn't dare to push him away. Her nose was filled with the scent of an adult man, and it was overbearing. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.